Now, without further ado, I call upon the first speaker from the government side of the House, Jenn.
Chair, in all instances of like whatever jobs that we work in, I think there is already proportional gratification for the kinds of performance that we have. We see this in professions where you get promotion based on your KPI or how well you're performing. We see this when, for example, IB teachers get paid more because they go through more skills training and they're perceived to have more skill sets, right? There's already precedent for all these sorts of things. We think that there absolutely needs to be a blanket policy to ensure that no child gets left behind in the education system. Perhaps the most important profession that we have today. What does side of proposition stand for? Three-pronged setup. Firstly, we'll calculate this based on an algorithm of it's going to be relative to your area, relative to your demographic. It's going to be a net improvement, not just like directly test scores. We'll also take into account intangible things like peer review, take into account student review, in which they'll have to justify why exactly they felt a certain way about their teacher. Intangible things like the amounts of awards you get as well. We think that like an improvement from a fail to a pass is already an improvement that we would cherish under our side of the house. Secondly, what do we mean by a proportional increase? We think we would firstly ensure an equitable baseline, but individuals that are perceived to have resulted in better performance in their students will be paid proportionately more. Thirdly, we will ensure obviously that there will be no abuses, will comply to regulations under status quo, have independent reviews of these sorts of things. With that, what are our two arguments in today's debate? Firstly, why it's principally justified to reward those who put in more effort into their performance. And secondly, what this actually incentivizes improvement and betters the academic environment overall. Firstly, why teachers are necessarily so important. We think this is for a few reasons. Firstly, you actually spend more time in school than with your parents. So the time spent with teachers is necessarily important for your formative experiences. Secondly, the impartation of information by teachers. When we're talking about things like specific subjects or even just your knowledge about the world at large, we think that this is largely given to you by teachers who you perceive as the authorities on education, who you perceive as being able to impart these sorts of things onto you, and you take them with you for life. Thirdly, about a love of learning and the way you're actually inclined to learn. We think that the way you are treated by your teachers or the sorts of role models that they set are extremely important in your formative experiences for how you approach learning in life. Fourthly, we think they're actually a final safety net for those who have been failed in all other aspects of life. If we're talking about individuals who perhaps did not have a great home background or individuals who do not have access to a lot of resources, these teachers are the individuals who are able to shape their lives. That's why we see so many successful people crediting their teachers with being able to change their life path. The conclusion of all of this is that teachers are extremely important in the formation of a child's experiences and their life paths. These all play into how well you do. And we think because they are so important, we need to have proportional gratification to ensure that to incentivize improvement, which we'll talk about later. But what exactly is the magnitude of this impact, right? We'll give you a few illustrations. So a teacher who simply does not care under the status quo, who simply fulfills a 9 to 5 bare minimum, is one that is not going to incentivize any sort of improvement within their students, right? We think that lazy teachers, who we see even more commonly under status quo, are not simply a byproduct of the current system, but a direct result of the fact that there isn't any sort of proportional gratification. A teacher who cares, a teacher who puts in work, encourages those who are failing, gives them extra help, fosters interest in a subject, helps individuals understand so that they're able to have better performance that will help them in life later on. So why do we think that this is something that is justified, right? We think that we actually see wage allocation and promotion being based on performance in the world at large. We say, for example, like we've told you, head teachers being paid more or administrators being paid more because of the extra roles that they have to take on. We see things like teachers that have gone through more trainings or teachers that are perceived to have a better skill set are actually being paid more under status quo. What we would do on our side is just furthering this already existing principle, but in a way that ensures that the benefits are actually accrued to children. We would reward the good teachers that have shaped our formative experiences and made them so much better. We would gratify you for the efforts that you actually put in. We think this is absolutely justified and is seen in every sector of society today. Secondly, and more importantly, why this actually incentivizes improvement of an academic environment. Note, panel, chair, that opposition is completely inadequate. We're unsure what mechanism they'll give to you. But we think that the current system with stagnant wages is one that has limited scope for improvement. We point to the fact that firstly, promotions and career progress is extremely rare. About in like 100 teachers in a school, only one of them manages to become head principal. We think that these sorts of limited scopes for career advancement mean that it's very hard for individuals like teachers to be able to want to progress or to be able to improve themselves because they foresee that there's limited scope for them being rewarded. But furthermore, we think that this isn't necessarily conditioned upon your performance as well. We see that teachers may be dissatisfied with their current work environment because they perceive that, for example, individuals become head teachers not because of their performance and the way they treat children, but rather the connections that they're able to have. The effect of this is that teachers feel that they would not put in significant effort into ensuring the improvement of children's performance because they cannot get something equally out of it. We cannot rely on teachers being inherently good and inherently altruistic towards these children, because at a certain point, if you're not getting rewarded for all the effort you're putting in, why exactly would you want to do so? That is something we question opposition. But what incentive do we actually have under our side of the house? We tell you that people are inherently self-interested, and the money is the sole gratification, which is universal, and which means that individuals will want to be incentivized to improve their performance. We say that these are things like having more wages for you to like actually pursue a holiday that you wouldn't be able to under status quo, because job wages in the educational sector are so low under status quo. We say it's things like being able to afford like better healthcare and all these sorts of benefits that incentivize you to want to do the best you can. So even though it may be hard to improve the performance of 1 or 2 kids, you'll put your best effort into doing so, and in the process improve the performance of the entire class at large. What do these stakeholders necessarily look like? We tell you the most vulnerable of students, those without motivation, those who have bad experiences with the educational sector. We think teachers will spend more time with these students to ensure that they're fostering a love of learning and fostering an interest of the subject so that they're able to pass. And this, although it may be for their self-interest, it ultimately benefits those kids. For those who don't understand, this may come in the form of extra tutoring sessions for these children. We think that even the average student who may not be so disadvantaged is likely to appreciate this new effort that teachers are putting in and want to reciprocate that sort of effort and put in more themselves, as opposed to kind of student apathy that we're currently seeing in public schools across the world. We think that even the most privileged of students will benefit from this policy because they're able to see their teachers putting in effort and able to capitalize on that, instead of teachers simply coming into work, telling you the material, putting it down, and returning home to believe that their job has never rewarded them for what they are. What we would do under our side of the house is actually have a holistic improvement, in the sense that we're able to judge things like improvement, judge things like test scores, but also things like achievements and the way teachers are perceived by their students. All these things are extremely important and helps us, and this motivation of a wage increase is something that we already see across the globe from because of things like the wage equilibrium that intrinsically rewards improvement. Under our side of the house, all stakeholders will be benefited. So what have we told you in this debate? We think that in order for no student to be left behind, for teachers not to just focus on the students that are most convenient to them, there needs to be holistic improvement of in every sector. We think it's principally justified to actually condition these wage improvements upon performance. The precedences that we've told you about, because of the fact that they're so extremely important in the development of a student. Ultimately, this incentivizes improvement. We would argue to you that this is perhaps the most important thing that we need to focus on, because this ultimately shapes the paths of individuals as they go forward in life. So proud to propose.
Okay, the PM spent 8 minutes and 19 seconds. To respond to the case, I call upon Leader of Opposition.
Hello, am I audible if I speak like this?
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay, awesome.
Oh, wait.
No problem.
Okay, you can start.
Okay. From proposition or speech, we've come away extremely unclear as to what the problem in the status quo really is, because they give us a lot of lofty analysis about teachers not being able to get promotions and this taking a hindrance on the students that are struggling academically. We fail to see any tangible examples of this happening in the status quo, and why individuals choose to enter teaching jobs if this is the case, and it's truly so problematic that they can't be going on these vacations and cannot afford luxuries like they say that they want teachers to be able to afford. We're going to be proposing 3 substantive arguments Arguments, but before that, respond to a few ideas that came out of their first speech. The first thing they tell us is that they want to have a model in which they look at test scores of students, they look at peer reviews and teacher rewards as well, and they also have independent reviews. This is quite holistic, and we appreciate this idea of wanting a variety of perspectives, but we think there's an issue of how you're going to be weighing these different metrics. There are many perspectives that you want to be considering as the school when you're looking for who you want to be giving higher salaries. But if a teacher has high test performance and low student reviews, or vice versa, how are you going to be providing these salaries to the students in the first place, to teachers in the first place? It's quite unclear as to what the prioritization between test scores or student reviews is, because in reality, you cannot just prioritize everything equally and have any point system based on that. We think that is all that is quite unrealistic to be looking at in the first place. The second thing they tell us is it's quite important to be a good teacher in the first place. We agree with this, but it's not demonstrated what the problem is and why teachers are currently not incentivized to be good teachers. Because what they tell us is that right now there aren't promotions and there are limited scopes for getting more money as a teacher in the first place, that thus teachers don't want to improve themselves and as teachers and don't want to progress. I would just posit that in the status quo, the vast majority of teachers are not like this. I do not know a single teacher who does not actively seek for criticism on their teaching methods, or is not actively excited by this, by being complimented by students a certain method as well. When teachers forward a certain new thing, for example, using Kahoot to be teaching vocabulary to students, and they see that teachers, that the students are responding well to it, we see that the teachers often adapt to this and accommodate for that more in their curriculum in the future. If in the majority of the circumstances and the situations that we live in right now, teaching is not like this, and the people who enter these teaching careers in the first place are well aware that the wages may not be substantially high, but have a passion for teaching and for self-improvement in this area, and thus enter this job as a whole. We think this characterization is quite uncharitable to what teachers are like and what they want for the betterment of their students. Before I get into a final refutation in our case, I'll take that PO.
We think it's great that you happen to live in a privileged environment where you aren't suffering from teachers who are apathetic to students. But throughout developing nations and throughout government schools, it is a pandemic, literally. What is your answer to all the children who are going to be left behind on your side of the house? Because that's where the contention exists.
Okay, we're going to be talking about the idea of students and how they play into this and are improved or not improved under our third substantive. But the first thing I want to acknowledge is this characterization that teachers are better in certain areas and not as good in others. We would acknowledge that the vast majority of people who go into teaching, they bother to learn about how to teach and about how to lead a class, and they bother to go into these areas, even if they're going to a public school or a private school or any educational sector that they're in. We think these are individuals who genuinely have a passion for teaching and passion for development for these students. We think it's quite brash and quite unfair to these teachers for you to be characterizing them as individuals who are extremely unenthusiastic about their work and are just there for the sake of money, particularly because you say that the money is not that good anyway and they're not going to be much better off. No, thank you. But the final thing I want to respond to is that when you say you want to be fixing the idea that current promotions are based on favoritism, we don't see why this is necessarily fixed. We still have the administrators being able to put in their opinion. You still have them making the final decisions as to what the wages are going to be. We think the people who are supposedly so corrupt and demonstrating such favoritism on your side are not actually going to be benefited on yours either. So moving into our substantive arguments. First, principally, teachers' professions shouldn't be made about entirely made about making money. Because we think that teaching is in a job in the sector of service. For example, you enter this because you're passionate about fostering your development in children, wanting to care for them and wanting to be that family away from your own family, as they try to tell you under their side as well. We think when you work with these students and you try to teach them, try to foster a generation with great knowledge and great understanding of the world around them, this is an example of a job within service in the first place. It's detracting from the genuine notion of the job when you force teachers to obsess over their performance by a specific metric, particularly one that is objective. Looking at doctors, for example, it'd be quite inhumane to pay doctors based on the number of patients that they cure, or adoption services and individuals who work that based on how many children they get into homes. We think these are metrics they're not necessarily fair to the charitable work that they are doing and the genuine passion that they may have for their work in the first place. We think it's quite principally unjust to be making this job only about money for them in the first place and forcing them to make this a large consideration of their own well-being. No, thank you. Second argument, it's unfair to penalize teachers for factors outside of their control, because students who are stubbornly disinterested in learning or believe that they have a set career path that they want to go on that is not in line with the subject in which you're teaching or the matter in which you are teaching is not something a teacher can necessarily control by being very nice or having very good teaching methods. This is not necessarily something that, and this is arbitrarily assigned to you as a student. Having resource availability between schools of different subjects. For example, my school highly deprioritizes the arts and gives them extremely lackluster resources in the first place. We think these are things that are quite disadvantageous to the performance of certain teachers within these first place and may reflect the teacher as students who are going into these classes as well. No, thank you. Finally, we think it's also unfair to penalize teachers for the subject that they're teaching, because on many subject matters, students may approach it with a negative mindset, or simply performance tends to be lower. For example, in harsh grading courses like math or science, where there are objective metrics and a lot of students tend to underperform in these areas. We think you face as a teacher a significant disadvantage here when you look at a metric of student outlook on your class or on objective test scores in the first place. The third argument, you diminish the quality of teaching when you move towards this path. Why is this so? Especially when you use objective measurements of performance, you start to, as a student, as a teacher, focus on short-term learning, memorization of charts, memorization of formulas, or short-term memory of how to apply certain skills, and you do so to optimize the ability for students to perform well on these tests, ability for students to do well on these things that are reflecting on you as a teacher. You do this at the expense of focusing on long-term learning, hands-on tasks, for example, or long-term projects that are applications of your knowledge, because these are things that take longer, they take more time, and they cover less content in your review or new content throughout the year. These are things that are deprioritized as a result of being forced to, as a teacher, try to formulate good short-term results in the first place. This also means that you are likely to prioritize students that you assess as a teacher to have the greatest potential for improvement and deprioritize the rest. So when they tell you that they believe the struggling students are likely now to be fixed and likely to be focused, this is not necessarily the case, because struggling students take the most work to improve and the most work to try to be able to gain any sense of passion within the subject and care for the subject in the first place. We think even if you try to help them, this doesn't mean that improvement is going to be anything more than menial. In the sense, you focus on the students who are in the middle of the spectrum and have the most potential to be growing and the ability to do so. Otherwise, the teachers who choose not to do all of these things, these deprioritizations and changing of teaching methods, are personally penalized for prioritizing student well-being and long-term learning. We think this is unjust and uncharitable to teachers. We're very proud to oppose.
Thank you. You spend 8 minutes and 10 seconds. I call upon DPM. DPM, you can start.
Yeah. I'm unsure as to what world the side of government, the side of opposition lives in, because for a lot of students, especially for people from myself who go to normal public schools in developing nations, it really isn't like teachers are going to come in and be waiting for criticism or be waiting for the opinions of their students to be able to evaluate it. Just recognize these things simply don't happen in a lot of circumstances. Recognize that a lot of characterization from the side of opposition is extremely privileged when they tell us things like, oh, teachers go into it for like a passion, teachers are extremely good, they're willing to take any forms of criticism, they're constantly trying to innovate and get newer methods of teaching. Recognize, Chad, that this isn't the situation in many areas, and they failed to recognize this from the very get-go. But recognize that a lot of their analysis as to why teachers tend to be benevolent don't harm us in any way. Well, if it's true that teachers tend to be benevolent, recognize that results should be pretty good anyways, and teachers should be doing a pretty good job when it comes to engaging their students. If it's true that they say teachers are constantly finding new methods, I don't see why this policy is a harm, because students will be excelling and teachers should get the gratification that they deserve. But recognize that it is a harm when teachers are complacent, when teachers are not doing what they're supposed to do. We posit to them what is their mechanism at that point. We posit to you that if it's true that we recognize that there are benevolent teachers, that there are teachers who simply go into the field due to passion, and we believe that these individuals to be further rewarded, and we think that this is actually a good thing, because recognize in a lot of countries, teachers who go into it for the passion are actually made use of, and they aren't paid very well. We think more gratification for their effort is one that's good, and we don't think we lose anything from it. But recognize for a lot of times teachers who are complacent, we have the actual policy, and we think that the side of opposition needs to give us a policy. If not, they lose the debate straight away. The second thing they say is that it's unrealistic to apparently be able to balance test scores and peer review. Recognize that I don't see the problem with this, because recognize the test scores and student review. So test scores means that there must be some performance or some excelling on paper to be able to show that this teacher is like actually doing a job. But I think it actually is a perfect balance, because recognize all their harms is that teachers will be focused on short-term learning. Teachers will just care about memorizing. This means that your test scores are probably going to be higher. But if it's also true that you want to mitigate this, I think student review is actually the best way to do it, because you have a perfect balance of both, because you're able to make sure teachers are actually teaching the students so your test scores are high, but they're also teaching them in a way where they actually understand things, where they actually comprehend and care about the students, answering about students being able to understand those concepts, answering the students' questions, caring about the students individually, not pressuring them. Means I think we have a perfect balance when we are able to evaluate on both sides. So we don't just have student review where maybe you have teachers like coming into class and playing with the children so the children are happy, but we also have test scores to be able to balance both sides of learning. So it's far more holistic on the side of government. The second thing they say is that teachers know their wages are not substantially high, but they still go into it. So they assume teachers are inherently benevolent just because the teaching salary is not extremely high. But recognize in a lot of countries, like in the country I live in, teachers actually get paid a pretty decent minimum, like far above minimum wage salary. And for a lot of people, they actually go into it because they feel like it's an easy option. Like, I'm probably not good in many things. In a lot of countries, it's very easy to get past teaching school. It's far easier than a degree, for example. The qualifications are less. People actually opt into it as a last resort, for example, or an easier resort, but it's usually that teacher training is usually cheaper. It's more accessible. People actually don't. I think that a lot of times individuals merely go into it because it's a more stable job where the income is usually in many countries fixed, and the effort they put in it's not so difficult, and it's far more accessible. I think it's untrue to say that the teacher salary is low and then they go into it, because in a lot of countries teachers actually get paid a stable far above minimum wage, and the degrees tend to be far more accessible. Using this characterization, we think teachers need an actual incentive to work and not be complacent, because recognizing a lot of other jobs, in a lot of other industries, you are constantly having KPIs where you're being evaluated. You're constantly being evaluated on some performance. But when it comes to teaching, I think it's unfair that you just have a fixed wage, because you're never able to evaluate you never give teachers an incentive to constantly upskill, other than assuming their benevolence. Just recognize some teachers may be benevolent, but some teachers aren't, and we actually have a mechanism to tackle that. The third thing they say is that promotions are still based on favoritism, and there's still favoritism, but recognize that this isn't about promotion. So exactly, we're tackling the problem that exists. So correct, promotions are far more it's far more general, and it's harder to tackle the favoritism that happens, because people people can hide behind the excuses of like, and it's more general and vast, so the administrators can just pick someone and then justify it. But recognize, if you actually have things like test scores, or there's an actual metric to measure out, it's far harder to be corrupt, and the incentive to be corrupt is far less, because it's like it's on paper, your test scores are on paper, your student reviews on paper, there's actual evidence, so it's far harder to be corrupt. That's something we actually tackle. I think that we are just tackling the problems of promotions being something that's corrupt and convenient. The fourth thing they say is that teaching is apparently a service, and passion, and there's apparently a lot of passion, it's a service, and hence it's inhumane to pay charities. So maybe to some people it's about helping other people, but a lot of times I don't see the harm in paying people more if they're doing something better. So for teachers that actually have a passion in it, I think being able to see that instant gratification, knowing that you're actually, because a lot of times I personally know a lot of teachers who do their job really, really well, but they feel under gratified. So they don't have much gratification. They're paid their fixed salary. There's not many people acknowledging their work. But I think for a teacher, the point at which you see your students, you're getting paid more, and you're getting acceptance from these schools saying that you are doing well, hence we're rewarding you. I think this is an instant gratification that you did, and I'm unsure as to why it's inhumane. They don't provide much links. It's just some words they use. But I think for a lot of times, it's far easier, it's far better, because for a lot, teachers are able to actually have an incentive to help these students. Just recognize, for a lot of times, I'm sure there's other circumstances that actively affect the learning of a student. Maybe their parents, maybe they're they're slower learners. But this is where our mechanism is extremely important. We say we wanted an individual review of each student. So it's not just a general average, but it's on an individual basis. So teachers can't just leave out the slow learners and focus on other people. They have to tackle each student. But if the student is extremely stubborn, of course we give leeway for them. But if they do help these students, and if they do improve the students, we do reward them. So we give them an incentive too, because it's not just about a more average and like general basis, but it's an actual evaluation of each student, and that's small improvements that they make. This means teachers actually have an incentive to go to the weakest students and actually give them motivation and incentive. Plus recognize every student can study, and every student wants to study if they actually have the right motivation, and teachers are the perfect individuals to do this, simply because they spend the most amount of time with the student, and that's their job. Proud to propose.
Okay, spend 8 minutes and 19 seconds. I call upon the DLO.
Hi, can you see and hear me?
Yeah, I can see and hear you.
Okay. Let me grab my time. Aspire to be a teacher because you think that the pay is extremely well. You aspire to be a teacher because you want to help other kids grow, and you want to foster a healthy learning environment in order for other students to have a happy childhood. We don't think that pay and these incentives exist in the first place, and that is not the reason why teachers become teachers in the first place. Team proposition fails to realize that characterization. I'm going to do 3 things in my speech. Firstly, whether it's justified to pay them proportional to their performance. Secondly, how this affects the education of students. And thirdly, my substantive, and why, even if we gauge under their own characterization, why teachers will inflict more pressure on struggling students. Before that, 3 key clarifications. No, firstly, that we support current measures of where there are more educational reforms in the status quo in the first place, because we think that there are more check and balances against bad teachers right now, where teachers and parents are likely to lash out against bad teachers. In the first place, we think that there are current measures that are already becoming more and more successful. But secondly, know that their characterization of teachers is extremely wishy-washy, because Prime Minister came out told you that teachers don't have enough of an incentive to work because they don't feel like they're being rewarded enough because the pay is relatively low. And then DPM comes up here and tells you that they have relatively good pay, they can still afford things like vacations. We don't really know whether teachers are well paid or not. Their characterization is very vague. But thirdly, know that they don't fix the problem of bad teachers in the first place, because even if they do have low pay, they still exist within these schools. Some students are still subjected to their bad teaching methods. They don't really solve the issue. I'm going to explain to you why we better have a mechanism against that. First question then on whether it's justified, because proposition came up here and told you that teachers have a very big impact on the formative experience of children, and therefore they should have proportional gratification. Two responses. One, we're fine with giving like really good teachers bonuses if they're successful in fostering a healthy learning environment. They need to prove why they're going to like give them extremely proportional directly on their salary, and why they need to defend a change in incentive structure of teachers, while we just give them bonuses whenever they do particularly well that year, for example. But secondly, note that there are a lot of people who play a huge role in the formative experience of the children. They never explain to you why teachers are unique and why they should be particularly rewarded for them if they're just doing their job. We don't think that teachers should be rewarded if their job is to help foster a healthy learning environment in the first place. But the comparative on our side of the house is twofold. One, we don't penalize teachers for the disinterest of students. Claire told you that some people may simply not be interested in STEM subjects, and therefore they don't put a lot of effort into these classes in the first place. Because that may reflect on the low scores of a lot of these students, and teachers are going to be penalized for that. We don't think that that is justified, especially if these teachers have a passion for teaching in the first place. If the students have a disinterest in learning, we think that the students should be penalized by like their faulty grades, but the teachers should have no impact, and their salaries should have no impact from that. No, thank you. But secondly, note that the teachers are more likely to teach out of passion and not self-interest. And note that they conceded to this. They said that it's okay if teachers teach out of self-interest. But the difference is when teachers teach out of passion and love for the students, they're more likely to care for their students outside of the classroom. And especially because they're extremely important for the development of these children in the first place, they're more likely to ask about their well-being, they're more likely to simply care about them, which is extremely important because many teachers are role models for these children in the first place. We think that because of that, they're more likely to genuinely care about these students, and this reflects on the development of children as well. Simply having self-interest and simply having like a superficial care and interest for these children doesn't really reflect on like the proper development of these children in the first place. Second question then, how will this affect the education of students? Proposition came up here and told you two things. Firstly, that teachers don't have career advancements in the status quo, so they're extremely dissatisfied. Two responses. One, we told you that the reason why teachers are teachers isn't to advance and become principal. The reason is because these service occupations exist in order to help others and in order to help children have a good childhood development. So we don't think that self-interest is particularly involved when teachers decide that they want to be teachers in the first place. But secondly, good teachers are still rewarded in the status quo. The fact that people recognize their effort of being good, the fact that people all want to be taught by this one teacher means that they are still being recognized, and they still feel satisfied if people recognize their effort. But thirdly, note that deputy came up here and told you that teachers are well paid in the status quo. So even if you do provide them with more money, the bad teachers aren't going to have additional incentive, because the problem is not money. They never explain to you why you're going to incentivize no thank you, why you're going to incentivize more teachers and the bad teachers to work even more. We don't think that this is going to do anything. But fourthly, even if they do have an incentive, these teachers are still likely to be extremely like they don't really care about the students. This looks like being very dismissive when students ask questions, and to force them to take worksheets and memorize things, even if they wanted to do Kahoots that would better help their learning. We think that when this is the case, even if teachers do put slightly more effort, it does not reflect well on the students' performance. But the second thing that proposition came up here and told you is that teachers are going to spend more time with struggling students. And this is where Claire's third argument directly clashes against this. Because firstly, I would argue that this is simply not true, because for a teacher and for the performance of a teacher, it is much more impressive to produce two students that can go to Harvard or Yale than to produce a class full of mediocre students. This means that you're more likely to focus on the students with the most potential, because they're the students that can get you the furthest with your salary. They're the students that can get into Harvard, and they're the ones that you're more likely to focus on. The result of that is that when you focus all your effort and resources on these 2 or 3 students, these struggling students inevitably get left behind. But secondly, even if this is the case, and even if we do buy the characterization that struggling students will have more attention, we think that the incentive is wrong. And principally, teachers should not teach simply out of self-interest. We think that they should teach for passion. The reason why these service occupations exist in the first place, and the reason why doctors' salaries are not dependent on the amount of patients they cure, is the reason for why teachers should not be paid by their performances on a principal level. Even if they do have more pragmatic impacts, I would argue that this is just principally unjustified. The comparative on our side is that teachers are going to optimize everyone's potential. The fact that if you're a visual learner, you're going to be learning through visual means. If you're likely to learn out of film and if you're more likely to learn through creative methods, then you're going to have creative methods that can optimize your learning and optimize your potential. We think that when teachers have a true passion and love for all of these students, they're not likely to just stuff them with worksheets that may make them learn in a faster amount of time. They're more likely to spend time and make sure that they fully understand a lot of the concepts that are important for the development of children. No, thank you. My substantive is why teachers, under their own characterization, that even if teachers will focus more on struggling students, why they inflict more pressure and why that's necessarily bad. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
So if you were to choose a trade-off, would you prioritize struggling, vulnerable students or some sort of metric of fairness towards these teachers?
Wait, no, we think that it is important for teachers to focus on struggling students, but that necessarily decreases under your side of the house. And we think that teachers should also focus their attention on like all students, while also like they should focus on all students, but they should prioritize the struggling students because they're the ones that need the most help. Okay, my substantive. We think that in the status quo, many struggling students often put little effort into school because either they give up because no matter what they do, they just perceive themselves to be a lot dumber and incapable than other students, or secondly, because of other circumstances like the fact that they have to take other jobs or the fact that they don't have time to study at all. So we think that even if we buy their characterization that teachers will focus on struggling students more, they will inflict a tremendous amount of pressure on these students because their performance, their salary is dependent on the performance of these students, because necessarily if some students lag behind, that means that their salary may potentially be lower. So we think that when this is the case, this is extremely harmful because for struggling students who don't even have faith in themselves, when teachers, especially because characterize how important they are, when teachers don't even have faith in them and when teachers show frustration and anger towards these students because they don't understand concepts, that is when these students have even more pressure, and that is when they're more likely to crack under the pressure. We think that this is extremely bad because that is when their performance becomes even worse. That is when they give up even more because they think that no one has faith in themselves and they don't have a reason to study even more. When they have tremendous amounts of pressure that other students do not have, that is when these struggling students become even more vulnerable under their side. Because of all these reasons, I'm extremely proud to oppose.
Okay. Spend 8 minutes and 15 seconds. To end the substantive speech from government, I call upon government sweep. Government sweep.
Yep. Hold on, just give me 1 second for the paper. So sorry.
It's okay.
Right, am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you.
The problem with opposition's case isn't just that it isn't contentious at all, because passionate teachers would exist on both sides of the house. It is an intrinsic feeling that no side can control. The difference is to those who aren't passionate. What is then opposition's answer to that? But the bigger problem is opposition's knifing themselves with every single piece of mitigation they get on the other side of the house. When they say teachers are passionate, therefore they create innovative ideas and interesting ways of imparting knowledge so all students that they teach will end up being able to learn properly and have good test grades on top of being able to enjoy a subject and actually absorb the knowledge they want. We say for a vast majority of teachers, those mechanisms, they are accessible, but the only problem is they don't have an incentive to go that extra mile. They don't have an incentive to cater to the children who are disadvantaged by the birth lottery, who don't have parents that on the other side of the house claim to be a check and balance. Because for a parent to come in here and complain to the teachers, to the headmasters about an inadequate system of teaching requires a parent to care for the unique education that the child receives. We question them for the students who don't have those parents that care, for the students that fell below the safety net of the birth lottery. What is their answer then? I think it is highly privileged of opposition to say, just because some teachers are passionate, we shouldn't enforce this duty to every single individual on our side of the house. Two main issues in this speech. Number one, who is the side that actually claims a principal victory on why we better the academic environment overall? And second, who helps the most vulnerable individuals, which has to be the biggest stakeholder in this debate? The first, I would like to clarify the government stance as to what the status quo is, right? Opposition says salaries are not high, therefore all teachers that enter teaching are extremely passionate and would do the best. I think this just isn't realistic at all. If this is true, you wouldn't have any students who are failing, you wouldn't have any students who don't have an interest in academics. It simply isn't logical. But more structurally, right, we think that regardless of whether you get a high salary or not, specifically in the public sector, there are a lot of benefits that comes by virtue of being a teacher. This looks like being a teacher opening up things like government pensions. This looks like not getting fired easily because a government on a federal level finds it extremely hard to track and balance against every single individual who works under them. The conclusion and what's the unique part here is that all these other benefits of being a teacher is not contingent on your performance, that you still get you get to accrue all of these benefits regardless of whether you have strong student performance or not. But most importantly, I think when opposition said, there are a lot of reasons you can use. For example, the student simply doesn't like the subject. These become the very reasons that these teachers hide behind when it comes towards ignoring individuals who simply weren't given the privilege of having a family that could afford tuition, or who weren't given the privilege of having parents that actually could sit down with them every single night to teach them and help them love math, for example. We would question what is opposition's answer towards all these vulnerable individuals on our side of the house. The conclusion to this piece of framing is that this debate cannot therefore be about whether the scale of harm is something that's extremely bad because you disproportionately punish some teachers. It's about the scale of benefit, but more importantly, the benefit you provide towards the most vulnerable of individuals, the students that we ought to help on our side of the house, because they would never be helped on opposition. These are students that they choose to leave behind. First main issue, who then preserves the principle of what teaching ought to be? Opposition comes and tells us that teaching ought to be something that's done out of a passion for teaching because it is service. And the parallel they gave us is doctors. I'm sorry, but it's a complete lie to the faces of every single individual in this debate. Every single doctor gets paid differently based on whether they are a specialist or not. Their performance and their KPI literally justifies things like bonuses on our side of the house. But quite importantly, opposition conceded this entire principle when they said on the other side of the house, they would have things like promotions and would have things like bonuses in Op 2 to justify an increased incentive for teachers to teach better. We say all those things therefore mean that teaching isn't something that's just altruistic, but inherently it is still a profession. It still requires a level of gratification that ought to be proportionate to the amount of work you put in. But most importantly, the reason why they lose this principle is because they couldn't justify a single harm on our side of the house when they said there are a lot of passionate teachers out there, and that's good. That's not contentious. They would exist on our side of the house as well. The question therefore becomes what about teachers who aren't necessarily so passionate or are more likely to leave out the most vulnerable. But more importantly, we would argue that because of this in of itself, we would justify a system that actually creates structural incentives for teachers to do better, and therefore we get a better academic environment as a whole. Therefore, leading on to the second issue, how then do we benefit the most vulnerable of individuals? I would say that if you have a teacher after the status quo that's extremely passionate and you're able to have a check and balance mechanism of your parent being to complain to the headmaster, you're likely to be at an international school or some level of school where you're able to have students' voices being heard. We would question that for a vast majority of individuals, this debate ought to take into account are individuals who are structurally failed by the birth lottery, and we think these individuals are left out on the other side of the house. They say it's hard for these individuals to generate an interest, and therefore it shouldn't penalize teachers who structurally are not able to impart their knowledge. I think the first response is merely the mitigation the other side gave. We think at the point in which you're able to ensure that your KPI on our side of the house doesn't go down because you are not neglecting these individuals and actually ensuring that they're able to get good test grades, for example, you would likely care for these individuals. And if we recognize that making it hard memorization doesn't work, I would say a teacher would likely turn to the more effective scenarios that opposition would like to point out. For example, using innovative methods to teach math. We think one of the greatest examples of this is literally what a lot of students subscribe to YouTube. We have teachers like Eddie who make math interesting. We think a lot of teachers, when they're able to be paid more on outside the house, have a greater incentive to therefore utilize these mechanisms to help specifically this group of individuals that opposition wanted to talk about find it very hard to absorb knowledge just because it is something that they don't like. But second, I would like to note how principally contradictory this entire argumentation is. If they say teaching ought to be a profession out of passion, why are they also willing to not penalize, to like not have the teachers who are unable to generate a kind of passion for these students who don't happen to like a subject, but it's integral towards their very formative years, it's integral towards their future of being able to develop basic skills? Why are they not willing to penalize these individuals when they say teaching ought to take into account the passion? Because what actually matters are the students that will end up being benefited at the end of the day. But second, they then claim teachers should therefore focus upon the most short-term scenarios of generating vast net benefits. Before 7, any POIs. Like focus on the short-term scenarios that actually generate a lot of immediate KPI benefits. For example, forcing individuals to memorize. I think if they focus their context on individuals who don't like the subject, therefore this doesn't apply, because the alternative mechanism then would have innovative mechanisms. But second, most importantly, we clarify this in our burden, right? We told you it isn't simply based on test scores. It's an algorithm that takes into account every single piece of information. For example, if you're streaming in your school, if a teacher will be able to help the last class students pass the subject that have consistently been failing, we think that will be proportionate and representative of the amount of effort and their performance within teaching those particular students. We think those are things are taken into account when we told students can write some level of review. And if this teacher created an innovative method, made them love math, we think that would translate in the review and therefore reward these teachers proportionately and far better than the comparative opposition wants to defend. Second, who will actually ignore these individuals on both sides of the house? We say that these individuals ultimately mean a teacher's KPI falling down and therefore not getting as much as a teacher can. Because teachers are inherently self-interested in the contentious cases, they are likely to take them into account and help them. On their side of the house, if they rely on passion and have no check and balance or no alternative, we would say these individuals who do not actually matter because they don't create an impact upon a teacher's way of life or a teacher's lifestyle, we would say that's the world in which these individuals are far more likely ignored. Very proud to propose.
Okay, spend 8 minutes and 29 seconds. I call upon the speaker from the opposition's whip.
May I keep my camera off just in case my Wi-Fi is a little bit laggy?
Yeah, sure. It's okay.
For an educator, the enjoyment of teaching and seeing results should be a reward on its own. Proposition wants to motivate lazy teachers with a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. But I will be proving why this not only detracts from the purpose of education, but also why we get all of Proposition's impacts on improving the quality of education in my classes. Before that, 3 quick clarifications. Firstly, the problem with the current educational system that our opponents paint is that many teachers, even the ones who care about their students and can be deemed as the better teachers, still don't receive enough money to be feeling like they are actually appreciated. Judge, this is a reason to improve and just increase all wages, not to create a wage ladder with ranking systems that dictate wages entirely. And if they're going to prove why necessarily there was a limited amount of money, then that's a problem with the system instead of how money is being distributed right now. Secondly, Proposition was quite unnuanced in their analysis of how this new wage system works. If there is a teacher that gets more money, then that means inadvertently there will also be a teacher who earns less money. You essentially pit teachers against each other for a limited amount of money that a public school has. This makes the system incredibly malicious and based on a toxic system of who gets more money instead of focusing on optimizing a student's potential. This means that if they want to mechanize their idea of lazy teachers being motivated, then that means the consistently good teachers will also thus lose out. They had to defend someone losing out, and that was something that they weren't willing to go to. Thirdly, we don't need to provide a policy as an alternative. Instead, we just have to prove why the status quo was better in educating students than our opponent's model. So we don't think that it was fair for them to push on to us that we had to defend a different alternative or necessarily a new mechanism that would allow for students to be able to educate in a better way. We're going to prove to you why their system actually detracts from learning and improves that system. No, thank you. Moving on to the 2 clashes. Firstly, is it justified for teachers to be motivated by higher wages? And secondly, on the pragmatics, on which side improves the quality of education for students as a whole? So firstly, on the principal clash. 3 reasons why we win this clash. Firstly, I like to analyze once again the purpose of teachers. We think that the role of a teacher is to optimize the talents of each student, to provide useful resources in their educational journey, and in general, to assist each student in making a transition into higher education. So this means it's not just about whether or not they can pass a test, or for example, they're able to give good reviews to a teacher. Rather, a good teacher would be very willing to take out a lot of their time in assisting a struggling student. And in that case, if they still fail, that means their wages are far lower. Instead, you discourage teachers from helping those who truly need help because they're seen as the basket cases who can't be improving anytime soon. And then secondly, you promote teachers based on an objective and superficial metric that doesn't just include these peer reviews, but also if they're going to be looking at educational records, we think that's a far more clear indicator. Personally, as a principal, if I saw that a teacher was getting consistently good peer reviews because they sang songs well, or they did read alouds very well, but they were producing bad grades among students, this would still be a teacher that I would prefer to fire. This is against the purpose of education, because instead you are rewarding the results instead of the process. We believe that if the educational system needed to make a choice, then we would instead prefer focusing on the process, because at the end of the day, that is truly what is going to get children better fitted for a higher education. But secondly, before that, I'll take your point.
If you agree that the process is extremely important, why is your counter mechanism to just simply increase wages for all teachers, disregarding the emphasis on the process, when Gov's mechanism actually provides an accurate and evaluative mechanism to ensure the process is one that's beneficial to all students?
We never said that our counter model would be to increase all wages. Rather, we use this as a principal reason to prove why there are some factors that are out of the reach of teachers and thus cannot be determined on a scale where some people would lose out and some people would win, because that's how your system dictates it to be. Secondly, the reason why there is a set salary for teachers in the status quo is because teaching is an act that is in and of itself very difficult. You need to have certain qualities, certain personality traits, and a lot of hard work and dedication. To give out money as a motivator is to degrade the efforts of all other teachers who are simply being disadvantaged by factors out of the reach. Notice that it's received absolutely no engagement. For example, students can give out unthought out reviews. If a teacher's entire livelihood is based on whether or not the students are necessarily more positive with their reviews, I'm not sure if that's actually reflective of a teacher's general skills. Or for example, test scores very much depend on each student and their abilities to partake in a certain subject. A teacher's livelihood cannot be determined by factors outside of their control, and because there was no response to this, we think that they've already lost this principle. But thirdly and lastly, no thank you. The reason why you want to teach should be motivated by passion. Though we say this time and time again, the only reason why we're saying this is because they've refused to engage with it and prove to us how passion was going to be increased on their side. The kind of passion that they're talking about is not the kind that's altruistic and genuinely for the students. Rather, this is motivated by superficial metrics for them to earn more money, to get another vacation. This cannot be the reason why teachers are willing to help their students. If you're a bad person that teaches incredibly efficiently and produces great results, you are still a bad teacher. We should promote teachers based on more than just results. Rather, good teachers are rewarded too on our side when they realize that their students are progressing and their students leave class with a smile on their face. Bad teachers also need to then on their side, the thing that gets worse is that bad teachers now join the educational sector only for more wealth instead of actually analyzing the drawbacks of teaching. Even if teaching is something that is incredibly difficult, we would say that this is actually the system that is able to weed out the worst teachers who are completely unmotivated to teach their students. Teaching is a service, and thus it cannot be motivated by wealth. Second clash, on which side is actually able to improve the quality of education for students, and we believe that our team wins this specifically because we analyze the reason why some students are not able to improve right now. Proposition repeatedly talks about how money is a universal motivation, and thus this will inadvertently and necessarily lead to the improvement of educational quality. Two reasons why this is false. Firstly, when teachers are motivated by money, their incentives necessarily shift. From our first speaker, we analyzed how teachers would focus on more gifted students. They spend more time with them, and they're more lackluster when they're engaging with students who are deemed as unable to change. They dismiss the concerns of students who they deem as bad students who simply cannot improve. This is against the educational system because it tends to be the most rewarding for the best teachers to be teaching those who are struggling the most. Yet they get very little out of it because those who genuinely have bad studying habits need more time and more help from teachers. So essentially, essentially the proposition is going to leave them behind because these teachers are only motivated by the dollar signs floating in front of them. But specifically, what happens when you get a lower salary? They were never willing to engage with this alternative, because you then instead become far more desperate. As Ashley told you in the second speech, you necessarily stress out students even more, because these students were already struggling to begin with. Would teachers just quit if they consistently get bad salaries? Teaching should not be based on what you get as a result of test scores. Rather, if you feel like you've been sufficiently motivated by the fact that your students are happy and because you see improvements, then that should be enough to gratify you as a teacher. If you as a teacher are getting high salaries but still feel like you are unappreciated, maybe this isn't a sector for you, because the educational sector requires dedicated teachers who care about the students, who are altruistic, who are willing to go hours beyond what they're being paid for to help their students. Those are truly the good teachers that are going to be benefited on our side. And we're able to weed out the bad teachers who don't give a damn about their students. At the end of the day, we're actually the ones who improve education. We're actually the ones who satisfy that principle. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Third up, I call upon the reply speaker from oppositions. I'll spend 8 minutes and 15 seconds.
Am I audible if I speak like this?
Yeah. Yeah, you're audible.
Okay. This debate has ultimately boiled down to two clash points. The first being, are benevolent teachers harmed? And second, are subpar motivated to help the struggling students? I'm going to be breaking down what happened within flashpoints throughout this debate and why I think we come out on top on both. So first, are benevolent teachers harmed? Because what they assert on proposition is that benevolent teachers and those who are doing their best in the first place just continue to be paid the regular amount or even more than that. No significant harm or draw on this. They assert this idea, completely ignoring our first two constructive arguments. First, we said there's a principal injustice forcing teachers to keep their wages consistently in the back of their mind in consideration, because any prioritization of certain students or certain teaching methods, even if they are effective, still comes potentially at the cost of their own well-being and their own wages in the first place. Secondly, we told you that you're penalizing teachers for factors necessarily out of their control, like students not caring about what they're learning, or certain subjects simply on average having lower performance or lower student enthusiasm. Both of these arguments we saw completely no engagement with from proposition. They can just dismiss these ideas by saying that they didn't exist without actually responding to why this is the case when we give you significant analysis about the existence of this in the first place. Furthermore, we gave you in our third constructive analysis about why long-term learning methods are fundamentally incompatible with a lot of the metrics that Prop outlined in and of themselves, including the objective test scores, as well as the other ones that simply just simply require less time, while you do want student favor but don't necessarily fall into compatibility with this metric in the first place. They completely ignored this analysis, the partners and myself, and for that reason we think that on the clash of benevolent teachers, they are being harmed, and it is unjust to be placing this metric upon them as well. But the second point, are subpar teachers motivated? And there were two parts under this clash. The first being that propositions that talked about proportional gratification and why this needs to be extended to teachers as well. We already told you within all of our speeches that there are existing measures to eliminate subpar teachers. For example, student complaints or parent complaints. It doesn't necessarily have to come out of parents, but there are going to be metrics in which students try to write against teachers who are being completely ineffective. We think these measures, or even just third-party examinations that already exist, are in place, and the employers are in place to try to make sure that this teaching is effective and is taking place. They can't just dismiss all of our examples by saying some kids don't have parents who care about their teachers. That's completely proportional and strawmanning of our argument in the first place. So they don't engage with this analysis. But furthermore, we already told you, especially within Wiley's speech, that if you have to force passion in the first place, these teachers are going to forward their passion superficially and at the bare minimum, because they are unmotivated. And within our third argument, we analyze this, and we completely see no analysis as well, other than some ad hominem attacks, as well as just saying that these things are not true without explaining why this is so. The second part of this argument is on struggling students, because at the end of the day, we think I think on both sides we agree that struggling students and helping them become higher within their grade performance, etc., is quite important in this debate. In Prop Whip, they said that increasing struggling student grades is a reflection of good performance. This completely ignores our third constructive, that it's unlikely that the teacher's focus is on helping these significantly struggling students, because to benefit them in the first place and to raise their grades takes significant time and significant work to take someone who is completely failing to someone who is passing or even doing better than just passing. We think throughout this debate, we've said that it's more likely to be the students within the middle of the spectrum, or exceptional students who have a lot of room to grow and to better perform, who are going to be focused on. They completely ignore all of our analysis on this sense and choose to only engage with what they think is beneficial to them. We think at the end of this debate, they've been incredibly unengaging on proposition, and we've engaged with all of their fronts. For that reason, we're very proud to oppose.
Spend 4 minutes and 1 second. To close the entire debate, I call upon the reply speaker from the government side of the House.
Side government opposition's continuous rhetoric that it should be about passion, I think is something that is very privileged and elitist, because the reason why we don't have teachers currently being people who work out of charity is the fact that they simply would not be incentivized to do anything otherwise. I think there were 4 main questions in today's debate. Firstly, what exactly are the incentives of these teachers? Secondly, is this a fair policy? Thirdly, who focuses more effort on like who and what stakeholders it involves? And fourthly, well, how is this effort materialized? Into the first characterization kind of toss up, right? So I think that the main contention was about whether these individuals would be complacent or whether they would be already motivated. Because they said that, oh, they would enter because they were passionate about a subject. We had a few responses to this, which I think went largely unchallenged. Firstly, we told you that individuals often entered a job because of stability and all the benefits that they got out of that. But that does not necessarily contradict with the fact that money will incentivize them to do more things, right? But secondly, we told you that even if you entered and you were passionate about a subject, just because you were decades before when you were a fresh, naive teacher, doesn't mean that you are now. Those things simply do not equate. And thirdly, we said, good, if these individuals truly are so altruistic, instead of monitoring them like your side would do otherwise, we would rather reward them for their efforts. This was entirely a wash under their side of the House, and that was their main contention as well. They said, oh, if they are really nice people, then is it fair to penalize those who didn't do so well? I think, firstly, the third opposition said, oh, lazy teachers lose out. And even though I'm replying, I can't reply to that. Like, I just want to question what exactly is so wrong with that. But furthermore, they said, oh, there will be some sort of externalities. We had a few responses to this. Firstly, we would take this into account necessarily under the mechanism that we pushed from first speaker. Secondly, we think that oftentimes it is the largest factor because of structural analysis that we gave about, oh, this is the most of the time that is spent learning, for example, or this is the safety net that occurs if you have been disadvantaged by the birth lottery. This is something that could change your life around. But thirdly, we question why exactly would this be a punishment? Individuals who did not have those kinds of improvements would not be penalized under our side of the House. What we're instead doing is rewarding those who do cause these kinds of improvements to materialize. Even if all of this happened, we would rather prioritize the vulnerable students who can be helped instead of the teachers who maybe are not able to help 1 or 2 students. Third question, who we actually focus on. I think this was also a wash as well, because the fact that we're talking about who would be helped meant that on our side, at least some people would be able to be helped, right? Even if it was those individuals who would go on to go to Harvard and Yale, that is still more than they'll be able to have under their side of the House. Our worst case is still better than their policy in entirety. But we told you, we gave you a mechanism of holistic improvement. So firstly, if you always want to pursue more, if this is something that could be pursued with more improvement, why would you just stop after helping 1 or 2 people? There's always an incentive to do more and to help these less advantaged individuals. But secondly, Maya told you in her in the second speaker's speech that you actually get more benefit because individuals who are already smart, you will not see a significant amount of improvement for them, and therefore teachers would focus on the least advantaged. We win this issue entirely. But finally, on improvement and how that materializes, they essentially conceded that it would make them put in more effort because they said, oh, they will try to pressure these children, they will try to get some sort of improvement out of them. That is literally a concession, as well as the fact that second speaker said they would give bonuses for good performance, but never told us how exactly they would do that and what metric they would would use. Why do we think that it's actually likely to be holistic methods? Firstly, because of what we told you in our mechanism, right? The fact that it is about student reviews. If you're trying to pressure them into giving you good grades, that would never happen. But furthermore, we say that in order that you have teachers for a long period of time, you have them investing in your improvement. Kids are usually more responsive to nice methods. We don't see why teachers would actively coerce them, especially the fact that we told you we would discourage things like punishment. We would discourage things like corporal punishment. The conclusion of all of this is that we've proven to you why we actually incentivize teachers, why they aren't as altruistic as often as they say they are. And even if they are, we would choose to reward them under our side of the house. They get no improvement whatsoever. At least we're able to help some individuals and ensure no student is left behind. Very proud to propose.
Okay, spend 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Guys, let me check my notes and then make decisions and then submit my ballot, and then I'll get back for verbal adjudications. Okay.